One of the biggest topics headlining American news today is about trans people and how our existence is affecting cis people's lives. It's quickly become a wedge issue that will be dominating the election cycle this year in the midterms. So let's talk about trans education, why it's beneficial for all kids, and how the rhetoric propelled primarily, but not exclusively, by the political right can be emotionally damaging for anyone in the LGBTQ community. One of the most influential pieces of anti-trans legislation came in late March of 2022 out of Florida. House Bill 1557, more prominently known as the Don't Say Gay bill, was big at headlines not only because it further restricted access to gender-affirming healthcare in the state of Florida, but because it targeted children and what was allowed to be discussed in public schools. The bill highlights that topics surrounding the LGBTQ community are not to be discussed with children in public schools from kindergarten to third grade. This includes topics as simple as queer teachers not being able to discuss their home lives and prevents teachers from answering any questions students might have about their own identities. Some of the most vocal backlash is coming from the political left for the right's attempt at sheltering children and hiding integral parts of society from them. I'm Maya Claire. Let's talk about why educating children on trans and queer issues and topics are vital to their development. Contrary to the belief that hormones are freely given to trans patients at the age of 18, it's usually after intense questioning and evaluations by gender therapists, the vast majority of the trans community discovers that something about them is different at a much younger age. Personally, I've known that I did not feel right in my own body since I was about 5 or 6. In every book I read and every movie I watched, I more closely identified with more feminine characters, and I've always felt more comfortable in female-dominated spaces. But being a kid and growing up in a sheltered sector of Los Angeles, even though I was more privileged than others, I didn't know what being transgender was, so I suppressed my feelings for over a decade, not publicly coming out as a trans woman or beginning hormone therapy till I was 19. While I do not regret the life I lived, I do wish that I had learned about the existence of genders outside the binary that is normally discussed and the fluidity that comes with the existence of gender from a younger age. So I had people to talk to, and I felt more comfortable. Being forced to go through male puberty almost killed me numerous times because I didn't feel as though I could speak up and gain access to hormone blockers. I didn't want to feel alienated or laughed at for being different, so I hid who I really was. Educating the youth about trans issues is important, not because the left wants to turn every kid trans as the right tends to claim, but to instead make the children who are different feel less alone and more comfortable in their own bodies, and the children who are cis to have a greater sense of empathy towards their trans and queer classmates. Trans people were born into the wrong bodies. It's not our fault, and we're just trying to learn how to be happy with ourselves and who we are one day at a time. The trans community shouldn't be made to feel any less human, which is the agenda the political right is trying to push. We are not lost or confused. We know exactly who we are. An anti-trans sentiment that is starting to garner more and more attention was boldly stated by Tim Pool, a libertarian content creator, in a recent video. After getting in a Twitter debate with prominent trans commentator Keffels, seconds after claiming that he wanted to keep trans people safe, he said this.
I also want to be factual. Trans women are not adult human females. They are adult human males who have undergone hormonal or possibly surgical and social transition to appear or present and identify as a woman, an adult human female. That is not to say they are. That's why we say trans women. Now, they often want to say trans women are women. There's a colloquial understanding to it. There's a colloquial issue or a semantic issue where, to a sense, I understand what they're trying to say.
Make no mistake, even when people who are moderate or liberal claim to care about the safety of the queer community, anyone who says that trans people are not the gender they identify as, or choose to misgender people based on their actions, is not an ally of the queer community. You cannot pick and choose which aspects of the queer community you'd like to support. That's not how being an ally works. Later in the video, he decided to further marginalize trans people, using conservative commentator Blair White as an example of how, in his eyes, trans people are more accepted in society when they pass as a woman or pass as a man.
Ben Shapiro pointed out that if he was with friends and he went to a restaurant and Blair White was there, he would say, "Go sit by her. She has a table for us." knowing that Blair White is biologically male. And the reason for it is too difficult to try to explain to someone why someone like Blair, who is overtly female presenting, is actually a male and he's using the wrong pronouns. If Ben were to say, go sit by him, he has our table, then the person would look around and be like, who, where? Because of the assumptions we make about social constructs based on gender. Certainly these things exist. There could be a very masculine woman and you say, sit by her, and they're like, where? I only see a dude. Oh, that's a woman. Wow. The point is, when it comes to definitions, woman means adult human female. Trans women are not adult human females.
Not only is he saying that you only pass as a trans woman if you're openly and outwardly presenting that way, but even then, he does not accept even one of his own colleagues as a woman purely based on the fact that she's trans. And just as a quick reminder to every trans person watching this video, you are valid regardless of how you present yourself on a daily basis. It is easier said than done, but try not to let this hatred get to you. It's not worth your energy, I promise. But how does this factor into trans education? Well, the majority of hatred towards the trans community comes from a lack of understanding around the existence of trans people, what that means, and ignorance breeds hatred. The right uses religious propaganda, claiming that trans people are the spawn of Satan and view them as less than human. At the end of March 2022, Tucker Carlson claimed live in front of millions of people that Disney, quote, supported the chemical castration of children because they had repealed their support from the now passed Florida Don't Say Gay bill.
Their main, quote, goal as a company is now to teach kindergartens in Florida that they can, in fact, change their gender just by wishing it so. It makes you wonder if kids in Florida can consent to chemical castration with no parental involvement. If that can be true, what exactly can't they consent to once we set that standard? Disney didn't say. But maybe there's another agenda here. Nor did they explain their fixation on the sexuality of children.
We're not going to spend too much time on this, but one, you can't get access to bottom surgery in the US under the age of 18 unless it's a life-threatening scenario. And two, I don't think Disney gives a damn, considering they basically ran the majority of Florida's government from both the left and the right until a couple weeks ago. They as a company don't actually care. Carlson's rhetoric around the issue is littered with disinformation, as is most of his commentary. Even among liberals and the left, a lack of understanding causes trans people to not be seen wholly. Many TERFs, also known as trans-exclusionary radical feminists, are women who think that trans women are just men pretending to be women, which is obviously not true. They may hold more liberal positions on other issues, but gatekeep the existence of trans people and view them as invalid. This ignorance isn't inherently anyone's fault. It's a complicated topic, but just because it's complicated doesn't mean it shouldn't be discussed. Sheltering kids from information on what being trans is will only add to the ignorance and hatred towards people who are different from them, and that can and does hurt society as a whole. Though we can make fun of current President Joe Biden for a number of things, he has not been completely silent on the issue. In early March, when the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, proposed a bill that would incriminate parents of trans kids as participants of child endangerment, Biden put out a statement condemning the governor. That being said, the president's lack of outward political action to ensure the safety and protection of trans youth and their rights across the country is not all that surprising either. He's doing the bare minimum, which is not nothing, I guess? It's hard to say. Presidents in the US and legislatures as a whole don't do much to actually help the majority of the population outside a good few like AOC, Bernie Sanders, Ilhan Omar, and if he gets elected in November, John Fetterman out of Pennsylvania. And of course, on the right, you have representatives like Matt Gaetz, who decided it was a great idea to take to Twitter and openly support an account called the Libs of TikTok, that openly attacked the Trevor Project, a group that provides mental health services for the LGBTQ+ community. They also attacked other trans and queer content creators, calling them groomers and pedophiles. Just a little suspicious, Matt, supporting that type of content considering your dating history. Introducing trans education shouldn't be something that is adopted exclusively at the state level. It should be federally mandated to be part of the curriculum. Trans and queer issues are not something that exists within individual communities. Sorry, not sorry, conservatives. We're kind of everywhere. By introducing queer education to everyone, regardless of how they identify, teachers will be helping to create a more healthy and empathetic environment for all students that they may not be able to receive at home. Members of the LGBTQ+ community are not inherently at risk to themselves based on how they identify, but instead by how they are treated by the people around them. Risks of self-harm and suicide decrease dramatically when kids have at least one person that accepts them, and if students have a safer space in the classroom and in schools amongst trustworthy adults and their peers, then they are more likely to feel accepted by society as a whole. Young students should not be afraid to ask their teachers questions, especially questions about what's going on in their lives. Also, introducing mental health services at all schools should give students a safe space to talk to a licensed professional and get them the help they need. Groups like the Trevor Project already work to provide hotlines and resources to the LGBTQ+ community. I'll link their website in the description if you want to check them out. Something that is rarely mentioned in mainstream media is the stark increase of the terms groomer and pedophile by conservatives to refer to trans people. The rhetoric is nearly identical to what was used to slander the gay community in ads like this.
That looks innocent enough, doesn't it? Lots of young people hitchhike. Seems like a good way to get from one place to another. But sometimes there are dangers involved that never meet the eye. So no matter where you meet a stranger, be careful if they are too friendly. One never knows when the homosexual is about. Let's take the case of Jimmy Barnes. Jimmy played baseball all afternoon and he didn't feel like walking home, so he decided to thumb a ride. He'd done it 100 times before, and he didn't think anything was unusual when the driver struck up a friendly conversation. In fact, he seemed like a real nice guy. What Jimmy didn't know was that Ralph was sick, a sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious, a sickness of the mind. You see, Ralph was a homosexual, a person who demands an intimate relationship with members of their own sex. So no matter where you meet a stranger, be careful if they are too friendly, if they try to win your confidence too quickly, and if they become overly personal. One never knows when the homosexual is about. He may appear normal.
And here's a clip from 2017 of Ben Shapiro saying pretty much the exact same thing.
What about this idea that you call transgender people mentally ill?
I do say that transgenderism is a mental illness because it's gender dysphoria. It's a psychological disorder. So that's not an insult to people who suffer from psychological disorders. You are not doing a service to people who are suffering from a mental disorder to humor them by suggesting that their mental disorder is reflected in objective reality.
The rhetoric seen in these two clips is taken from over 50 years apart, but is being recycled because the conservative movement knows that it's effective in manipulating their constituents, who are inclined to believe nearly everything their representatives in media and government tell them. The word grooming was used 40 times on the first day of the year, and nearly 8,000 times on March 29th, the day the Don't Say Gay bill was signed into law. The nearly 20,000% increase is anything but a coincidence. Conservative pundits recognize that if they get their whole movement to speak the same language and attack trans people, they're more likely to continue electing conservative representatives that can pass legislation that will further strip trans people of their rights and access to gender-affirming care. In Texas earlier this April, NPR reported on a protest occurring outside a hospital in support of access to transgender services, as the state had been under harsh scrutiny for not only shutting down care programs for new transgender patients, but also went as far as removing access to services for existing patients.
UT Southwestern Hospital had a respected 7-year-old transgender treatment program called Genesis, but the hospital suspended medical treatments for new transgender patients in November, reacting to the political pressure out of the governor and attorney general's offices. Texas Children's Hospital in Houston followed in UT Southwestern's footsteps in March, but went further, stopping hormone treatment for current patients too.
The propaganda manufactured by the right is working to their favor, not because it's unique or creative, but because it preys on people's ignorance and thus spreads fear. Understanding the ins and outs of everything surrounding transitioning is extremely complicated. No one is denying that. But because so much of the population lacks a fundamental misunderstanding that trans people are who they say they are, the lack of empathy only perpetuates the hatred. Issues like this are why trans and queer education need to be introduced to every child at a very young age. America claims to be the land of the free, but all conservative politicians seek to do is further deprive people of their rights. Transgender people are still not seen as a protected class by the federal government, and that quickly becomes a problem when 17% of the LGBTQ+ community live in states with no hate crime laws that include sexual orientation and gender identity, and 4% of the community live in states with no hate crime laws at all. Those states being Arkansas, Indiana, South Carolina, and Wyoming. In 2020 alone, 44 trans people were murdered in the United States for their existence, and this statistic does not include the 1 in 3 trans people who attempted suicide. Transgender people are not a threat to themselves because they are trans. They are shunned by nearly everyone around them, and by not having adequate access to proper education and resources, they feel abandoned and alone. One video on the internet like this is not going to be a magical cure to the problem, but discussion isn't even being had. Most of America's problems stem from a lack of information due to a broken education system, and the lack of LGBTQ+ education is something else that needs to be solved. But the difference between a high schooler not knowing what being transgender is and what the hell the Stamp Act of 1765 is the fact that we're being stripped of our rights and murdered for trying to live our lives. Teach kids about the world around them, because trans and queer people, like myself, aren't going anywhere. We're a fundamental part of society, and we deserve the same rights and protections as everyone else, and that starts by educating the youth. I'm Maya Claire. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. I wanted to tag this on as a little note at the end. It's not very organized, so I apologize for that, but I didn't want to leave you without any key information. Since I initially wrote this script in April, 28 states have introduced anti-LGBTQ+ legislation, with 8 states passing bills. A total of nearly 300 bills have been introduced so far, and we're not even halfway through the year. A piece of legislation that flew under the radar was Alabama's banning of puberty blockers for anyone under the age of 19, which can be punishable by 10 years in prison. A young trans woman was taken from her home live on Twitch in Tennessee. A former candidate for Mississippi governor stated that supporters of trans rights should be met with a firing squad. And in 2021, the deadliest year for trans people, news organizations collectively only spent a total of 43 minutes reporting on anti-trans violence. A federally organized genocide of trans people is coming. I don't say this to scare you, but you deserve to know the facts of what is happening on the greatest nation on earth. One of the more positive things I've seen is that Fox News aired a segment putting a young trans boy in a positive light, and while that received backlash from people like Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro, families seeing that story may grow a little bit of empathy for that family. With that being said, try and keep your head up. We've still got a long road ahead of us, but trust me, you're not alone in the fight. Have a good day, everyone.